All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We appreciate each and every one of you. I want to give a huge shout out to Pastor Sauls for putting all of this together for us, for aligning the missions and the ideas that we're going to have today. I want to thank each panelist for being here. One panelist may still join. And when she joins, we will welcome her. Before we get started, I wanted us to engage in some mindful movement. And so before we introduce the panelists and before we get started, I invite you all to come to a seated position. And then if you feel comfortable, close your eyes, placing your hands on your knees. And just breathe slowly and deeply. We'll take 3 breaths here. Inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose. Inhale and exhale. Last time, inhale and exhale. And then we'll reach our arms out to the sides. And then our arms will be parallel to the floor. Let's take 3 breaths here. Inhale through the nose. And exhale through the nose. Inhale. And exhale. Last time. Inhale. And exhale, and on your next inhale, we'll reach our fingertips up towards the ceiling. Your palms will face one another. Your shoulders will drop away from your ears. Take one last deep inhale here. And on your next exhale, we slowly lower our arms to our sides. We'll do this one more time, but this time we'll take a deep inhale, reaching our fingertips up towards the ceiling. Bend the left elbow and then take the right arm just to touch the right elbow. Just creating a gentle stretch here. On your next inhale, we release the elbows and then we'll do the other side. So we'll bend the right elbow and touch it with the left hand. On your next inhale, we release your hands to your sides. Now, let's shake our heads, really by saying no. We'll move our head to the right. On the inhale, exhale to the left. We'll do this 3 times. Inhale to the right. Exhale to the left. Last time. Inhale to the right. And exhale to the left. On your next inhale, we return to center, and then we shrug our shoulders up and then down to release it. 2 more times. Inhale up. Exhale down. Last time. Inhale up. Exhale down. And on this last mindful movement exercise, we'll do a gentle twist. So we'll reach our hands up towards the ceiling, and then we'll bring the left hand down to the right knee, and then we'll twist and turn. And if you're like me, you had some cracking in the back, and that's okay. I can hear my spinal cord twist and crack. Take another deep inhale here. And on your next exhale, lift your fingertips up towards the ceiling. And on your next exhale, we allow the right hand to come to the left knee, and then we twist to the left and breathe. Slowly and deeply. Inhale. And on your next exhale, we gently untwist, floating our fingertips up and towards the ceiling. On your next exhale, hands come to your side. And then once you feel comfortable, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for this mindful practice, and thank you all for joining today. My name is Malia Johnson, and I am the founder of the Elgin Foundation for Wellness. The foundation was founded in memory of my brother Elgin, who lost his battle with mental illness to suicide. We founded the foundation, and we started the organization with an aim to increase awareness. Like my family, we were unaware, but then there was a stigma attached, and so we didn't know, and we were afraid to ask. And so another one of our primary goals is to eliminate stigma, because we all go through our own challenges from time to time, and especially now, we're all experiencing something, right? And lastly, our aim is to reduce the rate of suicide, specifically in communities of color. And so again, I welcome you all. I welcome the panelists. And I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Sauls, who will introduce each panel member. Pastor Sauls.
Beloved, good day, good afternoon. So glad you're joining us. I know we have folk joining from a variety of places, and we are so glad that you are joining us. I want to just give a quick shout out to Malia Johnson, who is the founder and board chair of the Elgin Foundation, for her extraordinary leadership as we tackle this challenge around mental health and wellness. And they're doing an extraordinary, job, and I'm just honored to be a part of them. And while I was a senior pastor at Holman United Methodist Church, that's where I met her and her mom and dad, the Staffords, and so we continue, to do our work together, especially following the transition of my nephew via suicide in South Africa. And so that's brought us into the intersection of how we can bring faith and health together, but not just that, but South Africa and the United States together around this challenge. And so shout out to the Elgin Foundation. And today we, are going to be having this very, very thought-provoking, relevant, truth-telling conversation with three extraordinary professionals, very, very committed to the work of mental wellness, especially in the African American community, and I would say the Black community. And when I say Black community, for me as a Black immigrant, I use that word as an inclusive word, including both African American kin and our Black immigrant kin, because that's what it's about right now as we deal with what we are faced with during these perilous and tumultuous times. And so it's good to have with us today three friends and colleagues that I call them my companions, around challenges of mental health and well-being. And let me just introduce all of them, and then we're going to get going here. Good to have Dr. Curley with us. He is the Chief Medical Officer at the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. And we also serve together on the board of directors of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and just appreciate Curley for his friendship and partnership in this work. Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands is a licensed clinical psychologist and the author of Butterfly Landing. And we met when I attended a powerful presentation that she did with Nami Lamert Park around the challenge of suicide in the Black community, and she did an extraordinary job, and we hooked up, and we've been connected ever since. So really appreciate her. And then my sister all the way from Panama, Dr. Melissa Shepard Williams, is a native of Panama and serves as a clinician at the California Institute of the Arts. She's also adjunct faculty in the School of Cultural and Family Psychology at Pacific Oaks College, and Children's School, and is a family therapist. And so I'm so glad that they took time out of their busy schedules to be with us today to have this conversation. And I want to say at the outset, I know that Dr. Curley Barnes, will transition from us at about 2 o'clock. right at the top of the hour because of some other engagements. But we were able to grab him for as long as we could, around all of this. So let's dig in. As you know, our topic today is generational trauma, the impact of racial injustice on mental health. And we talking about this, or we are here because of a conversation Melitta and I had, a very, very in-depth, emotional, and heart-wrenching conversation that we had about what's happening, in this particular moment, where we see, a coming together of the challenge around COVID-19, but also now as a result of racial injustice in the United States, definitely the coming together of what was reset in 1619, when our kin arrived here, on the soil by way of enslavement. And so everything is really coming together right now. And we're talking about generational trauma. And so I'd like to just put it within the backdrop of, one, Juneteenth, because we are on the eve of Juneteenth. Juneteenth, as you know, is a holiday celebrated on the 19th of June to commemorate the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. But we also have to realize that this holiday was first celebrated in Texas, where on that date in 1865, in the aftermath of the Civil War, slaves were declared free under the terms of the 1862 Emancipation Proclamation. So I guess the word got a little late to Texas, around that. But there's a lot of movement and motion going on around Juneteenth. And I also want to lift up another piece because this all, has been brought up because of, Trump's, rally that he wanted to have in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on the 19th. It brought up another, painful experience for our kin, for Black folk in, this country. This rally was supposedly going to take place not too far from the site of the race massacre in the Greenwood or Black Wall Street district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That race massacre, of course, spotlights the formation of an affluent Black community and the gruesome events that totally destroyed it on May the 31st and June the 1st, 1921. And I lift up these two, and we can go on and on. June the 17th, 5 years ago, the massacre at Mother Emanuel, church in Charleston, South Carolina. What we see going on in the streets right now. Hence, this conversation around generational trauma and the impact of, injustice on mental health. We have the right folk with us, and so let's dig in, with what we need to say. We're going to start very, very basic, and ask, Dr. Barnes, as well as Dr. Shepard Williams, and Dr. Norrington-Sands, tell us a little bit about what is generational trauma, because we might think that people know what that is, but we don't want to make any assumptions. So we'll start, maybe with Dr. Norrington-Sands. We'll start with you, and then Dr. Barnes, and then Dr. Shepard Williams. What is generational trauma?
First, I want to thank the foundation for having this, and thank you, Melitta, for being here. I do want to acknowledge also that I'm a survivor. My father died by suicide more than 30 years ago. So in terms of the trauma, I definitely understand that as well. And in terms of generational trauma, I do want to take a step back and just acknowledge for all of us that we're impacted by what's happening. We're healers, but we're still impacted by what's happening. And I know for me, I've experienced a lot of emotional exhaustion just in terms of what we're seeing and experiencing right now. So generational trauma or historical trauma deals with events that happen to a group of people, and it's usually a group of people, and the effects are cumulative, so negative impact that we see from generation to generation. So we've seen that with the Native Americans, we see that with African Americans or Black Americans. So these traumas are transmitted in terms of things that we directly have experienced or things that we know our ancestors have experienced. And as a result of historical trauma, we have systemic oppression. So we see this on all the institutions that we function in. So education, health, judicial system. So these issues of racism have permeated through our systems, and now we have systemic racism. So we may have these blatant experiences of racism that we see, but we also have these systemic forces, right? And when we think about what's happening now, what we're experiencing, a lot of us are like a post-traumatic reaction to what we're seeing, because we're seeing racial trauma, racial terrorism going on. And so we relate to that, and that impacts our functioning. So when we think about what's happening now in generational trauma, it affects us individually in terms of our well-being and also collective, so our collective well-being. So that feeling, that sense of generational pain, right? And that trauma. And right now we're being triggered because we're having these reminders that society has a view that Black people are not really human. So that whole issue of dehumanization. So we're reminded of this racial trauma. And so it brings up those deep feelings of sadness and fear and rage, just a range of different experiences. And so we're all triggered at this point. And so when we think about racial trauma, it's very important for us to also know within the field of genetics, there's a concept called epigenetics. So what that looks at is that within someone's DNA, due to experience of stress or trauma, it can cause a change in how the DNA is read and transcribed. So the parents may have experienced a trauma or stress, which may cause a difference in how their DNA is read and transcribed to their child. So the child may not have gone through the trauma, but biologically they may be impacted by what the parents have gone through. So it's very important for us to look at it biologically, but and also historically in terms of the impact that generational trauma has. And when we look at how we're functioning as a people, that a lot of what's happened in slavery is still impacting us now. So the ramifications of slavery, a lot of times we're dealing with that because we never as a people had the trauma acknowledged, and we never truly healed from it. So Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary, her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, I would recommend that to anyone to really understand generational trauma.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you referenced, Dr. Joy DeGruy. We had the privilege of hosting her, at Holman United Methodist Church, and it was just during that time she helped me to come to terms with what I call post-apartheid, syndrome, because of, what we've experienced in South Africa. Dr. Barnes, any thoughts from you around, what generational trauma is? Anything you want to add?
Let me just first also add my thanks to the foundation and to you, Reverend Sauls, for inviting me to join. And my sister is a hard act to follow. She kind of laid it all out for us. Kimani, I commend you on your knowledge of genetics and DNA, because that whole concept of epigenetics is within medicine somewhat of a new concept. The idea that you don't have to physically change the chromosome, but there are elements to the chromosome like methylation of the DNA strands, or perhaps shortening of the telomeres, which are supposed to be a protective part of the chromosome, that those things can physically change and they can be transmitted from one generation to the next. I think the best example that I know about is the Irish potato famine, where the offspring of generations of folks who had been exposed to that type of trauma due to food impoverishment, they had low birth weight, they had developmental delays, there were just all kinds of measurable physiologic and psychological differences. I think some of the ways that we see it play out in our society now are in healthcare disparities, to be quite honest. One of the reasons why COVID had such a disparate impact and is still having a negative impact on the African American and other communities of color is because of things that aren't just socioeconomic, like access to care, but there's also a baseline of different levels of health burden that, say, African Americans and Blacks in general carry. We keep hearing about obesity and heart disease and diabetes. Those things are all common within our community at a greater rate than in the broader society. And since African Americans tend to have these problems, they don't survive COVID as well, but they also die at an earlier age. So there are significant, very measurable real health impacts. And fortunately, there are ways to mitigate that by trying to do education, but even in educated populations and people that have resources, middle-class women and even more affluent African-American women still have some of the negative infant mortality statistics. A Black baby in this country is 3 times more likely to die in the first year compared to non-Black babies. And there are things that we understand about that in terms of differences in access to care, but a part of it is just how the mother feels walking through life as a Black woman. There are stressors that are both obvious, covert, like racism, and then there's the kind of not so obvious stresses, like the implicit bias, how she's treated by her healthcare provider. If she asks for some type of relief from pain, are they likely to believe her? And there are a whole host of other things that are products of this whole, I would call it also the post-slavery syndrome, mass incarceration. There are so many systems that have contributed to Black Americans having a harder road to hoe. So I would just say that the trauma has biological components, and also there are a lot of psychosocial components as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, Dr. Barnes, there has been preconditions prior to COVID-19 that we have to be aware of, and amplify, especially because of the, how, the Black community has been impacted by COVID-19. There are some pre-existing conditions that we certainly have to be aware of. Dr. Melissa Shepard-Williams, I know in our conversations, you've introduced me to this term called frozen trauma. I've never forgotten it. Around that, if you would respond to the question about generational trauma and maybe lift up, what frozen, trauma is, especially, for some of us, who are Black immigrants, in this country, and what that, how that impacts us, as a result of it. Your thoughts?
Well, firstly, I want to thank you, Melitta, for all the work that you're doing for community wellness, and Pastor Sauls for always convening a group to have this dialogue that's so important, and it's part of our healing. It's essential to it. I would want to reiterate what Dr. Kimani and Dr. Barnes have shared about the psychological and psychosocial components of what we have inherited. So the pain does move from one generation to another. And it deposits in the body. It's amazing how the body carries evidence of every single experience of our lives, even at the molecular level. So epigenetics speaks to that. As things move from one generation to another. And as it relates to frozen pain, when the experiences of trauma for generations go unaddressed, then that pain is frozen. And we move in the world according to that experience of constantly being in survival mode. That part of our brain that's all about fight, flight, freeze in order to survive is connected to that experience of frozen pain. So the way we interpret the world around us, the world inside of us, has to do with that frozen pain that for generations has gone unaddressed. And part of that experience of it being unaddressed is the systematic oppression that makes sure that we remain as unaware as possible of the intricacies of our history. With that, the pain continues to be unaddressed. All these experiences that are creating upheaval and leading us to the streets to protest, this is the reactivity. I need to defend myself. I need to do something. So hopefully more of these dialogues are going to support us as a people in the diaspora to step out of survival mode only and move into thriving with greater knowledge, where there's a combination of being educated in detail about our history, but with the support of mental health intervention, because learning about this history is painful. We need to have the right support to process this pain so that it won't be frozen pain anymore.
Yeah.
So that we can respond to rather than just react to pain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, a lot of us, it's so easy for us to run away from pain, frozen or not, historical or not, heretical or not. I'm a believer that, pain is a path to new possibilities. And that's why, it is, so important, to convene these conversations, because it facilitates conscientization. And through that, we can then see how we can move folk from stigmatization, to be able to now take the necessary action towards, mental health and mental wellness as we deal, with this. Let's haste on to our next question, which is, how does, generational trauma manifest itself on the one end, and then how is that connected with your assessment of the current state, of mental health of Black people in the United States? Dr. Barnes, you want to take that one on, especially, given the scope and the breadth, of, Los Angeles County, in the United States, the mental health department, within, the county, and the work that that you, and our colleagues there facilitate.
Well, I thank you for asking, and certainly the Department of Mental Health is here. I would be remiss if I didn't say that if people are struggling or if you're triggered, even during this conversation, I want to put out something that hopefully our host can repeat even after I'm gone, which is our helpline, because I think a lot of people, when they watch programs like this or listen, it's traumatizing just to be triggered. 800-854-7771 is the number to call. But I think in terms of what we're seeing as a department is that first there was the pandemic of COVID. And during that time, everybody was sheltering in place due to the public health orders. A lot of people weren't going out. They weren't sure if care was available. And I don't know that we have specific statistics on African Americans at this point, but we know that as a country, African Americans have a higher burden of depression, anxiety than others. In fact, according to Mental Health America, a study showed that 16% of U.S. Black population reported having a mental illness over the past year. So that's about 7 million people. Now, I was taught in school that the rates of mental health disorders were equal across all communities. How they manifest themselves can be very different, though. I think in specifically Black Americans, they're much more likely to seek help from a primary care provider or a spiritual leader like yourself, as opposed to going out to seek care through mental health providers. So I think some of the numbers don't adequately reflect the reality, because people are seeking care through alternatives to the healthcare system, which has sometimes not met their needs. I would say that on average, adult Blacks experience about 20% more symptoms, but they're likely to report them as physical aches and pains, nervousness, feeling like they're down and out. They'll use words other than just depression. They'll tend to somaticize, we call it, meaning they'll have physical complaints, because that's more culturally neutralized. You can talk about your backache and how your head hurts, how your nerves are bad, but you don't say that I'm feeling depressed, because that suggests some sign of weakness. I would also say that there are some not so well coping mechanisms that we see, particularly in men. I know you wanted to have me here to represent the Y chromosome configuration, but I think that sometimes the acting out that we see around excessive use of substances, use of alcohol, recreational substances, that those things have escalated. Even though some people were sheltering in place, it allowed them the opportunity to indulge more in some of their negative habits. So I think we've seen some increases in people that are using substances. We've seen an increase in domestic violence. There have been more calls, I think, to the emergency services around both child abuse and spousal abuse, because people that are cooped up, they don't have the outlet, and if they're using substances, it's just a perfect storm. So the first pandemic was COVID. The second was the civil unrest that was a response to the killing of George Floyd. I think people seeing that, it wasn't new to those of us who are of African descent, but we also now had to come to terms with it. And I think, as our initial speaker said, it's exhausting to some degree to be the person who in your professional life may become the accidental spokesperson for Black America, and that, you know, we're kind of having the lived experience, but now others are beginning to share in that grief. And it's been very interesting to see how the acknowledgement of Black Americans that, yes, we do have these problems, that they do cause a burden for us, but seeking help has not always been the top of our list.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, connecting this historically is essential, because, you know, in so many ways we get caught up, you know, with the majority, you know, or a lot of people get caught up in ahistorical, you know, analysis, that these incidences, for instance, what we're going through right now, it started in Minneapolis. Well, it didn't start in Minneapolis. I mean, we're talking about, you know, knees on people's necks since 1619. I mean, let's be clear about that, you know, and having to just connect with it and deal, you know, with that, you know. Dr. Melissa, you want to say a little bit about, you know, how generational trauma manifests itself, and connect that with the health, you know, or the state of mental health, you know, of Black people in the United States?
Yes. I feel that as Dr. Bond said, being in quarantine state really heightens what was already problematic. What was a public health issue, a magnifying lens is on it now, because we are sheltered in place. And when ordinances say safer at home, that's not applicable to everyone. For people who were in dangerous situations, the level of danger increased in this state of quarantine. And so, again, going back to the importance of exploring how the body is in survival mode, this experience of being quarantined certainly increases the tension in the body. And so it's very important that with greater awareness, we do things that help us lower the level of stress in the body. And that's difficult when you don't have a support village, a love village, so to speak, resources to reach out to so that you can help in decompressing. Because our decompression is about more than the pandemic. For us people of color who've been marginalized for generations worldwide, this experience is even more difficult. I can't help thinking about Brazil. Identifying as Afro-Latina, I'm thinking about Brazil's favelas, a very tightly congested space, marginalized for generations, high crime, high use of substances. Going back to what Dr. Bond said regarding the maladaptive ways of coping with pain. And so at this time, with this quarantine, that environment is even in greater upheaval. The tension is higher. The likelihood of contracting the disease is even higher when you even look at what the favelas look like. Mm-hmm. So that's true in our whole African diaspora. Mm-hmm. We have less access to the health resources we need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So inaccessibility, inequity, certainly, you know, as part of how, you know, it manifests itself. Dr. Kimani, your thoughts?
Hold on one second. My son's phone's ringing. Hold on a second. I'm sorry. Sorry. So multitasking. So first I wanted to go back to what you said in relation to your foot being on my neck, right? So just paraphrasing Malcolm X. And he was talking about, it's not a chip on my shoulder, it's your foot on my neck, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're projecting what you're doing to me in terms of me having an issue, right? So not looking at the systemic oppression. And I also want to go to what Dr. Melissa was saying in survival. Most Black people, we're in survival mode. So it doesn't matter, you know, if we think about financially, but also those of us who are not struggling financially in terms of microaggressions. So we experience these subtle kind of digs all the time, questioning our competence, questioning our worth. So again, going back into that theme of dehumanization. So we see generational trauma in many different ways. So it's the overt historical trauma, also the microaggressions, and the implicit bias, which infiltrates every system. So many of us, you mentioned about the opportunity for us to heal through pain, right? The challenge for many Black people is that we don't trust systems. And understandably, you know, we don't trust systems because we've been oppressed by them. So many times if we go to the doctors, as we've seen in COVID, we go to the doctor, we have concerns, we express concerns, we're not believed, right? So the woman, I think in New York, who died, she went and explained and talked about her symptoms. They said, oh, you're just having a panic attack. She went home and later died, right? So we see so much inequities within our systems. We're not believed. So then we don't want to seek out treatment, right? So we don't want to seek out treatment because we feel like we're not going to be believed. Also, we recognize that within our systems that we're often misdiagnosed. So in terms of medically and also in terms of mental health. So a lot of times we may go in for a certain issue and it may be depression or trauma, but we're labeled as schizophrenic, you know, something very, very extreme that has a lot of stigma associated with it. And then we look within the community, we have stigma about mental health. So there's a general stigma in the community about mental health, but particularly within the Black community, there's a stigma about mental health and mental health treatment. And we understand where that comes from, the historical distrust, but also because as a people, we have been seen as less than, we're less likely to acknowledge that there's something wrong, right? And so something wrong to us might mean, are you saying we're crazy or cray? I'm not, you know, I'm not crazy. And then within our community, yes, we have cultural forms of healing in terms of the church, right? So many of us go to the church as the first line of healing. But sometimes what happens is that people will say, oh, just pray it away. You're not a good Christian. Just give it to God, right? So on some level, people might feel like, well, I've tried all those things, and those things, it's still not working. I need more help. So within our community, we need to have more conversations. And I appreciate the foundation because we're having more conversations about mental health and addressing the stigma of mental health so that we say it's okay to get help if we need it. And then also what Dr. Melissa was saying in terms of, you know, really having understanding of our history, but the totality of our history, right? So in school, we learn a small little portion of our history, which is not sufficient. We have to supplement that because we have to teach our kids, we have to know for ourselves that we are grounded in greatness, that our legacy is not, we're slaves, right? We are from a great continent and we were doing phenomenal things and we were stolen and we brought to this country. And so just to have things within context and for our youth to have that understanding. So again, they know they're grounded in greatness and they have that psychological armoring against all that negativity that they're encountering in society.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Very, very well said. We want to, we've talked a little bit about the fact that we are all in survival mode, and it is so essential to see, you know, how we can move from just surviving to thriving, how we can unleash resiliency, how we can draw from those who've gone before us, you know, and stand on their bold and broad shoulders to be able to face the rising sun, you know, unafraid and with courage. So we want to just turn quickly, you know, to, you know, some questions that our board members, you know, at the Elgin Foundation help us curate and prepare. And I want to start with two with Dr. Curley before we lose him, you know, around that. As we transition now from having received the information to now trying to see how we can move towards some solutions, you know, as we move from here. A couple of those questions. One, how can Black men create and hold spaces of healing for each other? how can Black men create and hold spaces of healing for each other? Because you see, for us, we try to, play the avoidance game. We try to, swim in denial. We try to figure out ways to, not deal what we need to deal with. But for such a time as this, given, what we see, hear, and experience, Dr. Curley, any thoughts, around, how men can create and hold spaces of healing for each other? Your thoughts?
Well, I have a few thoughts, both personal and professional. First of all, I'd like to say that it's important to have a space, and creating that into a safe space depends on the participants. I think the type of space that you're going to create in the workplace is very different than what you might create in your home space or in your inner circle of friends. For one, most of us now work in integrated communities where there are people from all different cultural backgrounds, and you have to start off from a place of respect to know where people are. But I don't think you have to apologize for the fact that you have been suffering and are a victim of what is institutional racism. And I think fortunately now that conversation has come out into the open. I don't think we have to couch it. I certainly have given talks and studied about things like implicit bias, which is the sort of subtle racism where people are sort of, it's unconscious and it's unintentional. Things like someone earlier mentioned microaggressions, but hopefully we're not in institutions that support outright racism, and if so, it's important to call that out and go through the proper process through HR to weed out those folks who might be the actual racists who are intentionally malevolently hurting you. But then to bring to people's attention when something happens, like I can recall during my internship going into a patient's room with a white coat on and carrying a tray, and the first response from the patient's relative was, "Oh, thank God the dinner tray is here." Well, it turned out it was a tray for a lumbar puncture, and I just kind of chuckled and thought, well, they just mistook me for the dinner staff. But at this point in my life and my career, I would call them out and say, no, I actually happen to be a physician. Turns out the patient corrected the relative, but I think those times you don't have to engage every single time around those moments. But, if you're in the store and someone comes up to you assuming that you're there to clean the floors as opposed to shopping yourself, call them out on it. I think that there are times when you can choose to not be silent, but you have to be very selective because it can be overwhelming. In terms of personal spaces, I think about the barbershop. That's probably the one time in my month where every two weeks or so, when I go and I'm in a space that is people that look like me, we can have open conversations. The language can get a little colorful, but it's going to be different. It's also going to be different if I go to a house of worship, which still tend to congregate around culture. I think those are safe spaces that we have created. And while some might look at those as being exclusive or something that's around selecting people that are just like you, I think it's important that we have that. Fraternal organizations, things like Greek societies, things like Jack and Jill, I think all of those spaces were created to sort of be a buffer against racism. And I don't think we need to be apologetic that there's still a need for some of those culturally relevant, culturally congruent spaces. And I think preserving them, supporting them, giving to them in terms of donations of money and time, I think that's exceedingly important, that we have to preserve a part of our culture, because unlike, say, Asian Americans or Latin Americans who came from a country where they can still relate around language or around shared food or folkways, for us, our culture was ripped away from us. We were brought here, and that's different than any other minority group. And that's an experience that I think we need to be more mindful about articulating, that we've had to create an African American culture from scratch, and it's going to look different and it's going to feel different when you participate in it.
Right, mm-hmm. And different doesn't mean deficient, right? Different is just another manifestation of God's creativity for us. So we may as well get used to that. I know we have a few minutes with you. I have one more question for you, Dr. Curley. But before I do, we want to invite those who are watching. We have a chat room. So if you would want to make some comments into the chat room or ask some questions, please do so. And we're going to try to see if we can get to as many as possible as we can. Drs. Melissa and Kimani, you will have an opportunity to respond to these questions as well, because I know you would have some responses, for that. So, Dr. Curley, this one, what can Black men do to minimize the effect of the microaggressions they experience on a daily basis? What can Black men do to minimize the effect of the microaggressions they experience on a daily basis? Your thoughts?
That's a tough one. As I mentioned before, sometimes it can be incredibly empowering just to call them out, because the person who did it may not have intended it, but that doesn't mean that it should be ignored or just neglected. I think one of the things about white culture that I have become familiar with is the avoidance of conflict. People don't want to talk about anything that's uncomfortable. And also there's this perfectionism that everything needs to be okay, and if it's not, we're going to ignore it. And I think for us, I'm sort of one of those people who will look at things and point out the blemishes and to realize that those are opportunities for improvement. So I think call it out when you can. Try to select the people that you think you can have an impact on, because just avoiding the engagement doesn't move anything anywhere. But I think you shouldn't feel the responsibility or the personal burden that you need to fix this for the universe. I think self-care is incredibly important. Even though it's a little scary right now with COVID, going to the gym, if it's safe, taking your time to take care of yourself, to exercise, or doing it in a park or outside, I think that's really important. And I also would argue that something that we started out today with, I want to really thank Melitta, because she's given me some tips how I can improve my meditation game. I had not incorporated the movements to it, but I think to think about mindful movement, meditation, living in the moment. And I think that's something that meditation has taught me. LA County right now, if you're a resident in the county, you have access to Headspace. It's an app that is available online. Headspace/LA County, I think, is where you go to look for a free subscription that's good through the end of December. It's been paid for by your Department of Mental Health. As it turns out, some of those meditations talk about weathering the storm, how you can have resilience, but resilience really doesn't mean that you have to be personally overcoming everything. But I think resilience is sometimes shoring up your own resources so that you can fight, because sometimes there are going to be battles, either personally or professionally, that you need to stand up and call out things for what they are. But the whole practice of meditation is being in the here and now, being in the moment. You can't change what's happened in the past, and if you perseverate over it, it's going to make you feel more depressed. And you honestly can't predict the future. I don't think any of us 6 months ago would have assumed that we'd be doing all of our meetings this way. So we don't know what's going to come in the next 6 months. Will there be a second wave? It seems likely, given some of the numbers. But if we just stay in the here and now, what we need to do today for this moment, to be thankful and grateful. And I would say, to the extent that you can, I am a person of faith. I confess that I'm not always in a house of worship at the times that most people are, but I'm thinking about that. That's a part of my constitution. I don't let it go. I hold on to it, because in whatever way you relate to a higher power or God, I think that's really important, to feel like you're a part of something that's bigger than you, even if it's the community around you, and to find out ways that you can connect to that community.
Yeah.
Those are my
yes, and certainly that spirituality, Dr. Curley, is a spirituality that must lead us, to restoration, that must lead us to liberation, to transformation. Because we have a lot of other spiritualities out there. One I would lift up in this moment that we are in, and that is, a spirituality of white supremacy, which clearly, is about marginalization, discrimination, oppression, and seek to violate the dignity, of everyone and everything that's related, to non-white. So I think that's very, very important. And so I'm glad you lift it up, so that we can, continue to make sure that we connect our humanity with our divinity, and in so doing, be able to then practice a spirituality that is uplifting and that invites us, into not just holy ground, but higher ground around that. So Dr. Curley, thanks so much. Stick around as long as you can.
Thank you.
And really appreciate you, man. Much love, much respect to you as always.
I'm glad it's being recorded, so hopefully I can hear my colleagues' comments, because I really wish I could stay the whole time. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Yes, thank you. Peace out. Let's turn to our queens here, our sisters. You've heard those two questions, especially as it relates to men. We would want to give you the opportunity, to just respond, to this. I've had the pleasure of connecting with with the men that you are associated with, by phone with Kimani's husband, and of course my jazz buddy, Brother Williams, which is Melissa's husband, around that. And, I hang out with Orlando too whenever I can, if I can catch him. That's Melitta's, her husband. But let's talk about men, Black men, how can we create and hold spaces for healing for each other? And then that second question, of course, how can we minimize the effect, of the microaggressions, that we experience on a daily basis? Your thoughts, as, professionals around that. Why don't we start with Dr. Kimani? You want to share a little bit about your thoughts?
Yes. So first I wanted to go back to what you were saying and Dr. Bonds was saying in terms of spirituality, right? So generally as a people, we are very soulful people. So our spirit is very much connected to our soul. And so when we listen to like soul music or eat soul food, like we feel like we're being fulfilled. And so right now it's very important when we think about self-care for us to really do things to nurture our soul. And that connection to spirit, that fulfills our soul for many of us. And I also want to also acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Shelley Harrell, who is doing soulfulness meditation. And so it really speaks to how within the context that we're living now, how do we live and function, acknowledge our greatness and still be able to cope, right? So in terms of men, I live in a house of men. And I also want to reflect back to my father in terms of his challenges, his mental health challenges, which in many ways related to being a Black man and the pressures of being a Black man. So in terms of overt racism and microaggressions. And to acknowledge, I think the first thing what's important is for us to acknowledge that as Black people, that we experience these issues, that it looks different for Black men and Black women, but to have these conversations and to talk about what impact this has, and also within our community to have a more encompassing embracement and acceptance that we're all different. We don't all have to fit into like a certain box as Black people. And I think that's a challenge that happens to many Black people and Black men, is that if you don't fit within this certain box, then that adds a certain level of pressure and stress. And so it's manifested in different ways. So I think in terms of us as a community, if we can embrace the full totality of who we are as a people, and for us to really encourage conversation and connection. So for other Black men to be able to communicate to other Black men about how they're really feeling in a safe space. So maybe not, on the basketball court, right? But finding a safe space that you can connect to your brothers and really reflect and talk about what's going on, so you can kind of let that guard down. So I think finding those safe spaces for connection, and as Dr. Bonds was talking about, finding and utilizing those cultural forms of healing, the barbershop or, prayer or whatever that might be, but really, really utilizing that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dr. Melissa?
I definitely can all that you're saying, Dr. Kimani, resonates with me. I would say the common thread being creating safety, a sense of safety, because our people have felt unsafe for so long, that being connected to frozen pain. And so to keep this in cultural context, we have so many ways of creating a sense of community through food, through music. In this quarantine, for my husband, who is, music is his middle name, that has been his therapy. And definitely I can relate to that, because for us clinicians, this season has been emotionally exhausting at another level, because while we're trained to manage our emotions in the presence of our clients, this particular time in history has made it more challenging, because we are triggered as Black people. We are triggered while being clinicians in support of someone else's pain, with all the different versions of grief we've been going through. As it relates to men, this touches me, especially now because we just became grandparents again, and it's a grandson, and we haven't been able to see him yet because of the quarantine. And we think about all the different experiences ahead of him, wishing that this turning point in history will be a positive one. We have a son. He knows that talk that we always hear about, the talk, because of what it means to be Black in this country and in other countries. Thinking about my father. I was born and raised in Panama. He worked most of his adult life in the Panama Canal, a place that even during its construction was just, the racism was pervasive. People went to Panama from all over the world to be part of that construction. But us, Black people of different countries who went to Panama for that construction, because I have roots in multiple islands, people who went to Panama from the islands, they were the ones that were discriminated against. Everything that was happening in the South, the colored water fountains and the white water fountains, in Panama it was called gold roll and silver roll. My grandma talked to me about that, what it was like to address microaggression. She didn't use that language, but what it was like to address microaggressions. I grew up hearing about these stories. So to be Black all over the world is to try to create a sense of connection to Mother Africa. We were stolen from there, no matter where in the world we are. So there's a long history in this experience of trying to advise each other on how to be safe in the world, whether we are men, whether we're women.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I could go on.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to see if we can. We have about 25 minutes left, and I know Melitta is monitoring the questions in the chat room. I want to quickly connect a question that was sent in, from one of our board members with a question that is, in the chat, and that is about children. We know that certainly children are severely affected by, what has gone on even before they were born, while they were growing up, and of course what they're observing, right now. And not just children, but the parents and those who work with them around how we can, help children process what's going on around them, and also give parents the necessary tools to be able to do that. Having said that, this question: how does a parent prepare their children, for the trauma they will experience living as a Black person in the United States? And how can we do this without causing, a child, trauma? And that question certainly, connects with what Kristen, is mentioning, in the chat room, as a children's social worker in LA County. Just a great need, for mental services for children in our, system. So maybe, we can respond in terms of parents, but also in terms of professionals, parents of children, professionals working with children around, how we can just surround them, during this time with the necessary support, love, encouragement, with all of the questions swirling in their minds and in their spirits. Melissa, any thoughts from you as a family therapist?
Sure. I think it's important to acknowledge that when we work with children, we're also working with the adults in the life of that child. And that can be a challenge because sadly, and because of pain that's moved from one generation to another that can express as, I don't talk about my feelings. It can be a challenge to collaborate with an adult that disowns their emotional life, let alone be available for the child's emotional life. And as it relates to the quarantine, children are experiencing it in a very specific way. Their behavior, they talk through their behavior, in their way of playing. We can have a feel for what's happening inside. They're having great turmoil in this quarantine. So it's important that adults really are connected to the resources that would help them address their emotional state so that they can be fully present for the child. And it's easy to describe it this way, keeping in mind an adult that already has supportive resources available and that practices self-care. It's very concerning when you think of an adult that lives in the throes of survival and not connected to supportive resources, and how can they be there for a child? I am thankful for those opportunities when we're able to collaborate with adults that are in great need of support. But I worry about those who don't have us or other forms, by us I mean clinicians, us or other forms of support, because this is the kind of perfect storm that moves the pain forward to this generation. I think about how important it is that we are having this conversation, because we want to increase the awareness of how desperately us adults need this emotional support so that we can be available to the children in the way they need us, so that we can have a conversation with them about the injustice that happens in the world, of course, with age-appropriate language that professionals can coach parents with, because they have questions and they deserve to know what they need to know to move safely in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Kimani, and then I'm going to ask Melitta to connect two comments that we have in the chat room, and then we're going to frame that in a question, for the two of you. But Dr. Kimani, your response just around, children, how do we build a healthy, holistic village around our children at home, as well as those who are in the system?
Right. So I'm speaking from the perspective as a mother of two teenage sons, and as a licensed clinical psychologist, just to frame the conversation. And building upon what Dr. Melissa was saying, it's very important to really address and identify and acknowledge that many of our parents are in survival mode. So personally, what we can do at home is to ensure safety within the home, right? So kids need to feel that sense of safety and structure within the home, and the adults do as well. And so part of a training that I do is a parent workshop that deals with how do you support your child, and then also how do you practice your own self-care, right? Because if you're not well, then it's very hard for you to give to your child, right? So how do you do that in a cultural context? So I'm just going to go really, really briefly through it, right? So in terms of what's going on now. So it's based upon this framework called psychological first aid. So number one, protect. So again, ensure that your child is in a safe environment. Talk to your child about safety issues. Be mindful of what your child is ingesting in terms of social media or the media in general. If they are seeing certain things, have a constructive conversation with them, not just, oh, you saw that? No. Okay, so this is what happened. What were your thoughts about that? Why do you think that happened? How does that affect you, right? So ask them very specific questions, because we know that they're either seeing or hearing, right? Because kids know a lot more than we think that they do, right? The other is listen to what they're saying, but also look at the message underneath it. So how are they saying it? or are they presenting in a way that's very different than they normally do? So we're looking at changing their baseline behavior. So if they normally are very outgoing, and then all of a sudden they're very withdrawn, you notice that they're very sad. So pick up on those types of behaviors. And I know that we're in a quarantine shelter in place, but how do we support our kids still being connected? So connected to us within the home, because we know that's a form of healing. And we know for our kids, having a connection to a supportive adult is the most significant resilience factor that they have, right? So how do we build that connection within our home? And then outside of the home, how can they still be connected to other people, extended family, maybe by phone, FaceTime, whatever that might be, to build connection? And then as parents, how are we modeling healthy behaviors? How are we modeling healthy coping behaviors? So Dr. Bonds talked about increased substance use. So if there's a parent who's struggling and they're, using increased substances, that's teaching your child that I can't deal with the current reality. I need to numb out, right? So we have to be very mindful of what we're modeling and then teach. What are we teaching our kids in terms of healthy coping strategies? So we teach, like Dr. Melissa, her husband loves music. So if our kids love music, maybe encourage that. So what kind of things are we doing within the home to set a framework? And as I mentioned, once they leave our home, we can't control what happens to them, but we can give them the tools to navigate life. So that's what we're trying to do, and trying to really help them so they're not traumatized by everything that's going on. But for them to be able to make sense of it, we need to give them the language sometimes, or help them process what they're seeing. So being willing to have these open conversations. And as a parent, if you're overwhelmed and don't know how to have the conversations, reach out to other people who do. Reach out to therapists, reach out to pastors, reach out to other people who can help you guide that conversation. And if you need to vent to your adult people, not to your kids, right? And go and vent someplace where your kids cannot hear that conversation, because kids can hear everything. And the last thing I want to say is, shower your kids with so much love that they feel overwhelmed with your love, okay? So I always tell my kids, my son, so much that I love them so much, and I say, I'm showering you with love. And they're like, okay, enough, Mom, enough. Do that with your kids. Shower them with so much love. They're like, okay, enough, okay? So just ground them in that sense of connectedness.
Yeah, great. Melitta, you want to just share some of our comments, and then we'll see how we can frame it, in a question for Dr. Melissa and Kimani.
Sure, thank you. So the chat box is live, so that's where all the action is. So we have a question, or you have a question from S. Freeman, and it states, what is to be said when you come from two races and both sides have caused trauma, causing challenges to support the movement when you do not appear included in the fight? What are your thoughts on that?
Can you read that again, Melitta?
So again, it says, what is to be said when you come from two races and both sides have caused trauma, causing challenges to support the movement when you do not appear included in the fight?
Yeah, that's really, how do one deal with the ambiguity that you find yourself in at the intersection, of being either multiracial or multicultural, right, as a person. Any thoughts around that from any of you?
Yeah, and I know Dr. Melissa has something to say about that. So I was just thinking in terms of, this is really a manifestation of an oppressive tool in terms of divide and conquer, right? So how do we divide groups so that we can't see our common issue as oppression? So a lot of times what we'll see, particularly is like between Black and Latino, right? So conflicts within groups, but this is a divide and conquer. And so when we see different groups talking about one another, bringing one another down, it's a divide and conquer technique, right? So acknowledging what that is. The other thing is recognizing that there are multi-ethnic collaborations and groups that focus on coming together, unifying to address certain issues. So what I would invite you to do is to see if you can find those types of organizations and be a part of those organizations, and maybe have courageous conversations with people in your family to educate them. But again, reserve your stress, right? So if it's too overwhelming to do that, or if it feels like it's not even worth it because they're not even hearing me, you are able to say or think, is it worth this time to have a conversation with them? Are they really going to receive what I'm saying? Or should I spend my energy trying to find other like-minded people?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Melissa, any thoughts from you?
I would second the emotion. Definitely, what a conflict it is to feel at an intersection, particularly because even if part of how the person identifies themselves is also Black, but a Black person living with internalized oppression, where you turn against yourself and your people. We have in this historical trauma also taken in the mindset of the oppressor, and so when that is in conflict with this movement, that can be paralyzing. It can be paralyzing, and so unattended turmoil is a huge part of this problem. And then there is connecting with a sense of allyship. So, like Dr. Kimani was discussing, connecting yourself with organizations, and if not organizations, people who are like-minded, perhaps people who also are going through this dilemma, this conundrum of, how do I support? Do I support? I can think of conversations with students who talk about how difficult it is to have these conversations with elders in their family who have a different point of view than the one they are developing. So generational differences. So definitely seek like-minded people so that you can ground yourself in awareness to make choices from a place of thoughtfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we want to go to another one. Catherine had one. Melitta, you want to read Catherine's one? Because I think this one is, interesting, as we always, kind of massage terminology and also the power of language, and how people read language, understand language, and interpret language. So if you can read that one, and then we'll ask our panelists to respond to that one. And then we do want to take one last one, from Orlando, because it has to do with the school district, and especially what's happening, with Black boys and girls, in the Los Angeles Unified School District. So let's, Melitta, you want to read Catherine's one?
Sure. I want to also touch on Cassandra's, which relates to Catherine's, and they're, tied together. And so Cassandra made a statement, and she said, I recently consulted with a respected healer and colleague regarding microaggressions. He discussed that he's no longer using the term because the microaggressions, because it's not a microaggression, essentially. He said the aggressions are not micro to be oppressed. They are only micro to the aggressor. Please give your thoughts. So in order even to tackle that question, we have to understand from Catherine, she has an important question. What is the difference between racism and microaggression? Like when we think about that, what's the difference? So those are two very important statements or comments, questions that I think you guys can tackle. Yeah,
these folk are heavy on this in this chapter.
I told you the chat room. But this is really important because we hear the term microaggression all the time. Sometimes we don't understand what it is or how it can be used or how it's been used against us. And so I think it's important to identify what a microaggression is and then kind of move from there.
Right.
So Dr. Melissa, you want to kick us off on that one?
Sure. So racism definitely is about discriminating against the group. When mindsets are moved forward that keep that group oppressed, narratives are moved forward to keep that group oppressed, narratives that are also internalized by the group. Microaggressions are an expression of that in the subtle ways in which these narratives move in the community. the community of the oppressor as well as the community of the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
An example could be, for instance, colorism. The phrases that are associated with colorism that happen even within our group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dr. Kimani?
Yeah.
Well, to me, racism and microaggressions are the same thing. Mm-hmm. Because racism, microaggressions are a manifestation of racism. Right? Mm-hmm. And so when we think about racism, it's a pervasive sense of inferiority of other groups, mm-hmm. and systemic ways to keep other groups down. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's perpetrated through all of our systems. And when we think about, I definitely appreciate the comment in terms of microaggressions, because for me, it's less important in terms of what the person's intention was, right? What for me is important is how did that impact the person, right? So when I think of more of the overt racist experience, those are the ones it's no doubt it's racist, right? But I'm talking about these subtle, and we can look in terms of the wording of it, right? But what I'm referring to is like these subtle kind of jags, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you go into the store and somebody's following you around, they're not following other people around. Or for me as a psychologist, this has happened to me so many times where people cannot believe I'm a psychologist. And they will repeatedly ask, like, are you a psychologist? You have a PhD, right? That's a subtle dig, right? And so recognizing what it is in that moment, I know it's racist. I know it comes from a racist place. So it's all encompassing. But when we think about these subtle digs, it's important for us to call that for what it is, because sometimes what's so tricky about those digs is it makes you question yourself. Like, was that racist? I think that was racist. I'm not quite sure, right? And so all that questioning, don't even question it. Yes, it was racist, right? And so, again, deciding at that point, do you want to educate that person or is it not even worth it, right? But recognizing just as a people, and unfortunately it's true, and we have to teach our kids this, which is unfortunately true, that they may experience overt and these subtle forms of racism. And the reasons that we need to tell them that is that they don't start questioning themselves and thinking they're less than, or questioning what did they do and all this kind of mental gymnastics, when these are things that people are projecting onto them. So we really have to help them be able to process how other people are receiving them. And I've done a lot of parent workshops, and parents will say, well, I want to preserve my kids' innocence. Why should I have to have conversations with them? Why should I have to have the talk with them? And we talk about, you're right, it's not fair, but it's reality. So if you don't have these conversations with them, we're looking at how do we preserve our children's safety, right? And yes, we do have to have conversations related to mortality, which we should not have to have, but we do, given the current reality that we're in.
Yeah.
I'd like to add quickly. May I add quickly?
Yes.
Because I, as I was listening to you, Dr. Kimani, you reminded me of some experiences I've had, and I wonder if they may add to this discussion about racism and microaggression. I remember when I moved to the U.S. 34 years ago, there were moments when I asked myself what you just said. Well, did that just happen? Because my experiences of racism in Panama were not quite like the ones here. So then there's the element of culture shock. For me, it was things like, are you speaking Spanish? Huh? Why are you speaking Spanish? Things that would not happen in the East Coast, but I digress.
Yeah.
But the idea that for immigrants, there can be multiple layers to the experience of racism, and microaggression being an expression of racism.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was part of a conversation yesterday where I talk about identify with, Dr. Kimani, this whole piece around double consciousness. And then I shared that as a Black immigrant, I have come to understand triple consciousness. And what does that mean? In terms of some extra things that I need to navigate,
yes.
As I seek to, understand the African American, experience and culture, and then with that, how do one then work it into, a structural and systemic society infected and affected with white supremacy, and then bringing, my trauma from apartheid in South Africa in it too. So it's a triple consciousness thing, and you're right, just the different layers. How this manifests itself is so essential. We want to quickly get to a question about the Los Angeles Unified School District, because when we talk about children, they certainly, have a lot of our children as the second largest school district in the United States, around that. And we have a principal, that sent in a question. So I'm going to ask Melitta to read that question and to read it correctly, because she lives with this principle.
I better read this question correctly or something. So this question is coming from fellow board member, but more importantly, my husband and best friend, Orlando. And he is asking, what can a public school do to meet the needs of their Black students that have experienced trauma to help them be successful academically and beyond?
Yeah. So, Dr. Kimani, if you can tackle that one, and I want to just lift up, both the book and the documentary Push Out that you talked about, when you did your seminar, and of course, my friend and sister Melina Lawrence did a powerful documentary that was screened on PBS around Push Out and what's happening to our Black girls in LAUSD. Dr. Kimani?
Absolutely. Well, I actually do trainings within LAUSD on cultural context and trauma. So it really focuses on issues of historical trauma, microaggressions, adverse childhood experiences research within an urban context, courageous conversations. So that is an option in terms of your school requesting that training. But it's also, it's so much more than the training. So it's looking at the school culture and the whole system. How does the system promote the well-being of Black students? How does the system let our families know and our students know that this is an anti-racist system, right? So because there is that sentiment that it is anti-Black, right? There needs to be a more intentional conversation, and not only conversation, action, showing that the institutions are anti-racist. So we look about safety. We need to know as a people that we're safe within these institutions, because we've seen so many times where we haven't been safe, right? So in terms of the film Push Out, the book Push Out, we've seen so many examples in which Black girls have been pushed out of schools, right? And also we know for Black boys, particularly, in terms of when we look overall in terms of the school to prison pipeline. So how do we disrupt that pipeline? And I also want to acknowledge that within LAUSD, George McKenna's resolution, which was passed. So the resolution to address the achievement gap, for the historical achievement gap for African American students. So within LAUSD, really pushing and advocating for, okay, now that the board resolution is passed, what's going to happen now, right? So one of the action steps was to have an African American study group for parents within each local district, right? So how are we ensuring that that's happening in a way that our parents know about it, and that it's a consistent way to get support to ensure that our Black students are being supported, not only academically, but social-emotional as well, within a cultural context, so to understand our social reality. So our reality is very different from everybody else. So how do we have those very direct conversations followed up with true action?
Yes. Dr. Melissa, any thing you want to add to that?
You're on mute.
I forgot I muted myself. I just would want to reiterate the idea that the main focus is safety. Mm-hmm. How do we make sure through all these different forms of assessment that the structure of the environment upholds safety, mm-hmm. not only for the children, but also for the adults in the environment, in the setting.
Right.
Because if the adults that are responsible for the safety of these children are not well themselves,
Absolutely.
that's a perfect storm for institutional oppression to perpetuate.
Yeah.
So there needs to be institutional accountability. There needs to be a greater willingness from the people who are in the administrative role to learn about the cultural narratives that make their school what it is, and to not be married to what they have learned already about a particular culture, learn about the unique experience of each person, adult and child, so that it informs their choices, rather than having this approach of, I'm the adult, therefore I'm the only expert.
Right.
We need to allow each other to be experts in our own lives.
Right.
Absolutely.
And learn and let it be a collaborative experience.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I just want to add 2 more points to that, because,
Yeah.
in terms of safety, a lot of our families, Black families, particularly in certain areas, feel the sense of fear of their children walking to and from school based upon the neighborhoods. Yeah. So we really have to look at and advocate for safe passages for our students coming and leaving schools, so that safety issue, and also the issue not only of physical safety, but psychological safety. So do our students and do our parents feel safe in terms of psychologically within these systems? And many times no, because there's a sense that they're being judged, or that they're not being valued, or they don't understand the culture. So what are we doing to show their psychological safety within our environments? And particularly for Black parents, a lot of our Black parents have been traumatized within schools. So their own school history is informed by their own school traumas. So a lot of times when we do outreach to Black parents, or to parents in general, the comment is, oh, Black parents don't come to these things. They, we try, they don't come, right? But why is that? We need to look at why is that, and really address cultural ways that we're trying to outreach to our parents and really show that we really value them. So not just writing them off like Black parents don't come. You need to take more of a ownership and responsibility in terms of looking at why that is not happening and addressing that.
Yeah. We've come to our to the close here. We want to quickly just we have several questions and comments. Dr. Melissa, Dr. Kimani, is it okay if we put your email addresses in the chat in case some people want to ask some direct questions?
Yes.
So I'm going to ask Melitta if she can, hook that up for us and just put your email, addresses in there. Melitta, you can put mine in there too in case folk have, questions for me as well. We especially want to do that because of what Elizabeth Casper mentioned. Melissa, this one, I think, well, both of you can actually connect with this. She says, as an ally and Latina therapist, how can I hold a safe space for my Black clients regarding ongoing discussion of racism, discrimination, and trauma? So, Elizabeth, as soon as you get these emails, I want to encourage you to go ahead and just send that, because you have an African-American woman and you have a Black Latina or Afro-Latina, on the panel right now that can probably give you some excellent resources around that. And thanks for the work that you are doing. As Melitta prepares to share some final thoughts, let me just express my sincere appreciation to Dr. Curley Barnes, to Dr. Melissa Shepard Williams, and to Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands, just for making the time to just enlighten us, and just really help us, work through this as we seek to move the needle, around mental health in the Black community, from stigmatization to compassion. That's what it's about for us, to see how we can allow the pain that we've experienced to become a path for us to new possibilities as we pursue, the destiny that God has for us. So you've done, as always, an excellent job. I feel much smarter right now, and I do that every time I talk with y'all, in terms of, so we just really appreciate it, around that. My final words, I just want to lift up two quotes. One, I think sums up the time that we find ourselves in. And another one talks about our own personal health and well-being. So James Baldwin, I think sums up, where we find ourselves in this country right now, especially with what is emanating from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Baldwin writes, "It is certain, in any case, that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy, justice can have." And so we're certainly experiencing that right now, with all that's going on with us. But in the midst of all of that, we can face the rising sun if we adhere to what Audre Lorde talks about in terms of self-care. And I want to thank Dr. Cheryl Grills for introducing me to this, quote, and this, basically saved my life, around that as I seek to balance, engagement as well as, wellness. Audre Lorde writes, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare."
Mm-hmm.
Just powerful, poignant words that we certainly need to hear right now, as we navigate these perilous and tumultuous times, trying to continue to grow in our resiliency, as we deal with generational trauma and understand the impact of racial injustice, on mental health. I want to thank my sister, Malia Johnson, for her courage to say yes when this was recommended, knowing that sometimes I can come up with crazy ideas. But I thank you for your trust, your partnership, and your friendship as you continue to lead. You have the last word, my sister.
All right. Thank you again. I want to thank all of the folks who joined in on this very important conversation. And I really, truly want to thank Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands, Dr. Melissa Shepard-Williams, and Dr. Curley Bonds for giving us the information that we need to acknowledge that this is happening, kind of identify what's happening within our bodies, and sort of some steps to move forward. So as we look to heal, we cannot heal if we haven't acknowledged that there is a healing that needs to take place, that we have to be able to identify that there is in fact a problem. And then once that problem has been identified, we can find ways to move from surviving to now thriving. And so we thank you so much for the tools that you provided us today, and the stuff that we can use as we move forward. And I'll make sure when I send out communications that I will put your points in those communications, the different things, the different resources, the different tools that you have given us so that we can move from surviving to thriving. One thing I want to mention is that on behalf of the Elgin Foundation, again, we want to thank you for joining. These conversations are really important. This really came from a conversation I had with Pastor Sauls about my children and, how I was managing emotionally. And then I came to tears because I didn't know sort of the next steps. My 9-year-old son came to me after watching, police officer with knee and neck and didn't understand what was going on. And so I had to explain to him, but he was explaining his frustrations to me, which made me in turn emotional. And so talking to my 12-year-old and 15-year-old and then looking for additional resources, we said, hey, there's a community of folks who can help us all learn how we can connect with our children or how we can connect with other folks as we also learn how to move through this sort of trauma that we experience. If you're like me, I felt that I could feel the pain throughout my body, like Dr. Bond was saying. And that, to me, let me know that there was much more going on than was currently happening in today's time. And so, I thank you, Pastor Sauls, for helping that transition just from a conversation become a reality and something that we can all share and, and experience and learn to heal from continuously, because it's a continuous healing. The Elgin Foundation.
Right. I said great.
Yeah, okay. And so I just wanted to say, make a couple of announcements. The Elgin Foundation will be hosting our scholarship it would have been a breakfast and golf tournament, but given the times, we're having a Zoom scholarship presentation on July 18th. So more information will come. You can also visit www.theelginfoundation.org for more information. Again, that's www.theelginfoundation.org. And if you're looking for a way to sort of continue with the mindful movement, you can follow me at Be Well with Mel. That's BEE Well with Mel. And every Monday I host a free yoga class where you can see someone who looks like you, who can connect with you, who cares about you, who loves you, and only wants to see you be well and to thrive. So with that, again, I thank you all so much for joining. And it was such a powerful discussion, and it's something that we need to continue. Like, we can't stop here. We have to continue those very important discussions. And so,
blessed Juneteenth, and as Angela Davis puts it, the struggle for freedom is constant. A lucha continua. Peace.
La lucha continúa.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.